Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. Tonight's lecture is going to be covering Chapter 12, where we're going to look at economic crimes that fall into three different subcategories, as we will later learn. That would be blue-collar crimes, white-collar crimes, and green-collar crimes. Now, as far as our learning objectives for this lecture, we're going to spend some time looking at the history of theft offenses and how they've changed. We'll look at larceny, burglary and arson, business fraud, exploitation, employee fraud, embezzlement, all those different things. But we're going to look at theft on a grand scale and see how theft has changed or morphed from a long time ago to our current situation where we're at right now. We're going to also kind of take a look at the difference between what a professional and an amateur thief is. And there are some big differences in there, and you'll find that out. We'll look at some different forms of shoplifting, some different forms of white-collar crime. There'll be some definitions, and one of the terms that we're going to learn will be Ponzi scheme. And what is that? Just by nature of the second word in that phrase, scheme, you can already figure out that it's some type of deception or fraud. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with talking about some of the efforts that are out there to control some of these types of economic crimes, specifically white-collar crime and green-collar crime. So, I want to start off by showing you a crime clock. This is something that is put out or published by the FBI on an annual basis, and it takes all of the Part 1 crimes, and every police department in the United States is required by the FBI, which is the clearinghouse of what they call the UCR report, to report certain crimes. And there are other things that they report too, different types of crimes, but for Part 1 crimes, there's 4 violent crimes, and there are actually 4, even though it only shows 3 on here, property crimes. Now, the reason I show you this clock is because they put it together in such a fashion where you can look at it and you can see here that there's a property crime, even though there's different types of property crime. There's one that occurs every 4.1 seconds across the U.S. So this is something that's big. It's grand in scale, and you will soon find out that while there are different types of these economic type crimes, you'll see that there's different reasons for perhaps why people commit these crimes. So moving on, fact or fiction. Remember, this is the time where we take a minute and we ask a question, and it's just there to get your brain kind of moving, get the blood flowing, and make you think about it as we go through the lecture. Remember, I may or may not give you the answer as we go through, but look for it as we're moving through the lecture. So fact or fiction, most theft offenses are committed by trained professionals who know what they are doing and escape detection. That's kind of an interesting fact or fiction, and I think you'll find out the answer as we go through this particular discussion. So, moving on, blue collar, white collar, green collar crime. We know that theft is on the rise, and I've taken a couple of photographs from some news broadcasts regarding package thefts and the just overwhelming amount of package thefts that are taking place across the United States. Because we don't go to the store that much anymore, and we have all of these companies that allow us to online shop, it's very easy for us to get things delivered to our homes, but at the same time, the opportunities that are out there for individuals to commit different types of theft are becoming quite a bit more abundant. And it doesn't separate itself or segregate itself by gender, because you'll see that there are both men and women, both young and old, that are involved in these types of thefts. And there's different rationales and reasons for everybody that does it. Another real quick fact or fiction. Most white collar and green collar criminals get a slap on the wrist if they are convicted of crime. And I think that might be our thought, and we'll answer that hopefully as we go through the discussion. But with property type crimes, are the penalties really high enough? Are they high enough to really deter someone from doing it, or do people already know that they might just get a slap on the wrist, and therefore the level of deterrence, if that's a good way to put it, or getting caught is enough to make you not want to commit these types of offenses? So a little bit more information. California voters had high hopes for, if you remember, Prop 47. This was a ballot initiative that passed in November of 2014 to lower criminal penalties for various property and drug offenses, thereby easing the state's prison overcrowding. And we know that's an issue, so that's really, we don't have to debate that. And we know that, we have to reduce the prison population. As a matter of fact, it was a court order that we got that done. But the fact that we're releasing individuals, could that actually cause an unintended consequence that nobody really saw, that if we start letting people out of prison, that we might start to see an increase in certain type of criminal activity? So with nearly 60% voter approval, Prop 47 reduced 6 nonviolent felonies, including certain drug offenses, to misdemeanors, and required misdemeanor sentencing for property crimes in which the value of the property involved is less than $950. The pre-Prop 47 threshold, if you will, for felony sentencing was $500. So they've even changed the dollar amount. So if it was $500 or above, it would be a felony for theft, let's say, and but now it's $950. So does that kind of make sense? So we've reduced some felonies to misdemeanors, and we even lowered the threshold of the value of property. And is that, or has that been, an unintended consequence of this? Well, the changes mandated by Prop 47 went into effect immediately, and the initiative allowed for resentencing of individuals convicted and sentenced even before the passage of Prop 47. So it wasn't just from this point forward, this proposition is going to pass, and anybody that gets arrested under the new guidelines, the penalties are going to be a little bit less, etc. But it's also a little bit retroactive, meaning that if you've already been convicted of that type of crime that is now lower, they're going to go back and resentence you. So I ask you what that means, and I'll let you think about that and let it settle in, okay? And we'll come back to that hopefully later on. But I've got a chart for you that was published by the California Department of Justice and the U.S. Census Bureau. And it takes a couple of categories of theft, and it shows us vehicle break-ins or vehicle burglaries. So if you can look from 2007 all the way going towards 2011, we see a decrease, and we know that crime has been decreasing, not just in California, in certain areas, not everywhere, of course, but overall, even in the United States, we know that violent crime has been down from a while ago, and even property crime has been down from a while ago. And then we see a little uptick here in 2012, and then it starts a little bit of a drop again to 2014. I'm sorry, 2014. But then you see the passage of Prop 47. And now when you look at 2015 and 2016, you're starting to see an uptick or a spike. So again, we can debate both sides of the issue. I'm just giving you food for thought. Was this an unintended consequence, or does it really matter, or do people even care? So that's vehicle burglaries. Now, here's one that talks about shoplifting. Remember, this, if you stole a certain amount of merchandise over that $500 threshold, it was a felony. Well, they upped that to $950, and then they reduced some of these things that used to be felonies down to misdemeanors, which is actually just a ticket. So shoplifting would fall into that category. And if you look at, we had a spike, from 2007 to about 2009. We had a spike, then we had a drop, and it was kind of like up and down here and there. But in 2014, with the advent and the passaging of Prop 47, you now start to see quite a significant increase in 2015, but then you see a little bit of a decrease, actually quite a bit of decrease in 2016. So just again, just food for thought as we go through this chapter on economic crimes. So what is an economic crime? Well, just by definition, it is an act committed in violation of the criminal law. So it's going to be a violation of law for the purpose of monetary gain and financial benefit. So economic crimes are, at least in your textbook, but typically they're divided into three different distinct categories. And we'll dive into these a little bit more later. But for now, we're going to take a really quick just overview, if you will, of these. So blue collar crime, white collar crime, and green collar crimes. So blue collar crimes, these are kind of common law theft crimes, such as larceny or burglary and arson. And white collar crimes are those that involve business enterprise, such as embezzlement or price fixing or bribery. And then green collar crimes, those are violations of laws that are designed to protect the environment. And so the development of these types of crimes and their nature and extent are some of the things that we're going to go over as we go deeper into the chapter. So let's talk a little bit about the history of economic crime. So economic crimes have occurred throughout recorded history. And about 3,000 years ago, the Code of Hammurabi ordered the death penalty for such crimes as stealing from a palace or temple treasury, or selling stolen goods, or making false claim to goods. Theft was a problem in Roman bathhouses, and slaves were assigned to watch bathers' property and clothes. And of course, some slaves even stole the clothes themselves and maybe resold them and actually made some type of profit. Under English common law, and this was a while ago, okay, theft was defined as the taking of another person's property without their permission or consent. And to be convicted of theft, the thief had to A, deliberately deprive the owner of their lawful property, B, using stealth or trickery or fraud, and C, with the intent of permanently keeping those items for themselves. And I put a link down there to some of the legal info or legislative websites, to where if you're looking for a specific penal code relating to theft, because we're in California, the California Penal Code is the book that you're looking for that has all the sections that are violations and the punishment. And so you can look up any one of those sections there. So taking something by accident, however, or mistake, was not considered theft if there was no intent to deprive the victim of their property. So for example, if somebody accidentally takes the wrong jacket from the restaurant's coat rack. However, taking something by accident becomes theft if once the mistake is discovered and there's no effort made to return the item to their rightful owner. So, I mean, I have a couple of examples there, and I just covered one. Taking the wrong jacket, is there really an intent to steal, or did you just accidentally take the wrong jacket? Or at the airport, maybe, where you might take the wrong suitcase or something like that. So, these are things for us to kind of think about as we go through some of this. So, while first committed by amateur thieves and pickpockets, cities developed, and a permanent class of urban poor came into being, and theft became professional. And by the 18th century, three separate groups of what they called property criminals kind of evolved or became active. And these were skilled thieves, smugglers, and poachers. Now, skilled thieves, these are individuals that typically worked in larger cities such as London and Paris. And this group included, like pickpockets and forgers and counterfeiters who operated freely. They congregated in what they called back in the day flash houses, public meeting places, often bars or taverns, that often served as their headquarters, if you will. And at those locations, deals were made and crimes were plotted, and the sale of stolen goods was, they would negotiate the sale of that. And then there were smugglers, and these are individuals that moved freely in sparsely populated areas, and they transported goods such as alcohol or gems or gold or spices without paying tax or duty fees. Okay, and then the last group would be the poachers, and these typically lived in the country, and they supplemented their diet and their income, because remember, these crimes have financial gain, with game that belonged to the landlord or other people. And by the 18th century, professional thieves in the larger cities had actually banded together into small gangs, if you will, to protect themselves, increase the scope of their activities, and to also help get rid of or dispose or even sell stolen goods. So, again, kind of some interesting, concepts here. But now we're going to kind of move into, and we're still under the realm of history of economic crimes, but we'll talk a little bit about the development of white collar and green collar crime. So while we sometimes think of these business related crimes as new phenomenon, they have actually been around for hundreds of years, ever since the Industrial Revolution began. And the period between, let's say, 1750 and 1850 witnessed the widespread and unprecedented emergence of financial offenses like fraud and embezzlement. And frequently they were perpetrated or carried out by respected middle-class offenders as the banking and commercial systems started to develop. In the late 1930s, the distinguished criminologist Edwin Sutherland first used the phrase white-collar crime to describe the criminal activities of the rich and powerful. And he defined white-collar crime as a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of that person's occupation. So again, this white-collar crime became more prominent during the industrial era, and we talked about how Edwin Sutherland first defined white-collar crime and who they were committed by. Remember, it was typically attributed to the wealthy class, and green-collar crime is a subdivision of white-collar crime and is motivated by profit, and we'll get to that. And as Sutherland saw it, white-collar crime involved conspiracies by members of the wealthy classes to basically use their position in commerce and industry for personal gain without regard for the law. And often these actions were handled by civil courts because injured parties were more concerned with recovering their losses than with seeing the offenders criminally punished. And consequently, Sutherland believed that the great majority of white-collar criminals did not become the subject of criminological study. Yet the cost of white-collar crime is probably several times greater than all the crimes customarily regarded as the crime problem. And in contrast to street crimes, white-collar offenses breed distrust in economic and social institutions. It lowers public morale, and it undermines faith in business and government. So green collar crime, on the other hand, a relatively new concept, can be viewed as a subdivision, as I said before, of white collar crime, and green criminals are motivated by profit and therefore not eco-terrorists or vandals. They want to make profits by logging in restricted areas or poaching protected fish or animals or avoiding the payment of governmental fees. And each of these elements of economic crimes we'll probably take a look at as we go further in the chapter. So out of the millions of common law property and theft related crimes that occur each year, things like larceny and burglary and arson, most are committed by amateur occasional criminals. And these are people who do not define or view themselves as committed career criminals. Their crimes are in the moment, and they're spontaneous, and they're unplanned, and often not very lucrative, meaning they don't get that much. They may be teens seeking excitement rather than monetary gain. Even angry people out for revenge who break into somebody else's house to take their valuables just to damage it. And occasional property crime often occurs when an unplanned opportunity to commit crime, and we call this situational inducement, suddenly presents itself. So we're talking about opportunistic crimes, if you will, or the opportunity. So like things like an unlocked door, car door, or a purse left on the counter, or an unobservant store manager not paying attention. And situational inducements are short influences on a person's behavior that tend to increase risk-taking. And when you couple that with financial and social problems such as, let's say substance abuse, they help push people into theft. But these amateur thieves, they lack planning and expertise, and their crimes are likely to put them behind bars. And then finally, occasional criminals may deny their criminality and instead view their transgressions or crimes as out of character. They claim that they were only borrowing the car when they're stopped by police. When confronted by, let's say, store security, they contend that they were really going to pay for the merchandise that they had hidden under their coat. And because of their lack of commitment to a criminal lifestyle, occasional offenders may be the most likely to respond to what we call the general deterrent effect of law, meaning like if the punishment is high or so severe, maybe people won't steal. So that, again, this is opportunistic. So fact or fiction, as we're kind of looking at that photo, we asked, most theft offenses are committed by trained professionals who know exactly what they're doing and escape detection. Well, that's really not true, because we just read that most theft is the work of amateurs whose acts are spontaneous and unskilled. It's a crime of opportunity. So let's now look at what we would call, let's say, professional criminals. And professional criminals make a significant portion of income for their crime. So professionals do not delude themselves with the belief that their acts are impulsive, one-time efforts, or nor do they elaborate rationalizations to excuse their actions. While the amateur may try to minimize their guilt by claiming that their victim was insured or something like that, like, hey, insurance will pay for it, so it's no big loss, the professional's only regret is a slow market for stolen goods. So guiltless professionals pursue their craft with vigor, attempting to learn from the older experienced criminals the techniques that will enable them to earn the most money with the least risk. So again, their big thing is, Non-violent forms of criminal behavior are undertaken with a degree of skill with these professional thieves. And again, it's monetary gain. It's maximizing financial opportunities while minimizing the possibility of getting caught. And there's a couple of pictures. I mean, professionals, they don't make noise. They not going to leave fingerprints behind. They're aware of their surroundings and cameras and neighborhoods and dogs and signs and all that other stuff that falls into that realm of professional criminal. So again, by definition, offenders who make a significant portion of their income from crime. And it's kind of funny, I show you the picture here of a stolen, stripped vehicle. This was, there are professional thieves that this is what they do. They strip certain parts of the car and they sell those parts because there is a high demand. So now let's look at some specific types of theft. So theft or larceny was one of the earliest common law crimes created by English judges to define the acts in which one person took for his or her own the use or property of somebody else. And according to common law, larceny was defined as the trespassery taking and carrying away of the personal property of another with the intent to steal. And the reason that trespassery is in there is because you would typically have to go onto somebody else's property or land or something like that in order to get the property, and that was the trespass. So it's the trespassery taking. And again, this is the common law definition. Now, the definition of larceny has evolved with the growth of manufacturing and the development of the free enterprise system. And because commercial enterprise often requires that property be entrusted to a second party, larceny has also evolved to include what we call the misappropriation of goods that have come into a person's possession through a legitimate means. And we're going to talk about some crime sections in a second. The commercial system would grind to a halt if people who were given merchandise to sell or transport could not be held liable for keeping the merchandise for their own use. So now we're going to kind of look at some different sections, if you will. And a lot of times you'll see that, again, some of these sections have changed according to dollar amounts, or we talked about them changing from felonies to misdemeanors. So the FBI now records about 5.7 million acts of larceny annually, a rate of about 1,775 per 1,000 persons. Now, again, larceny by definition, so pay attention, taking for one's own use the property of another by means, okay, other than force or threats, okay, on the victim, or forcibly breaking into a person's home or workplace. So it's simple theft. So it's stealing your trash can or your potted plant or different things, okay? So larceny rates, let me get back to some stats, declined about 20%, or have declined about 20% in the last decade. And according to the National Crime Victimization Survey, more than 11 million larceny thefts occur each year. And unlike the Uniform Crime Report, that's the UCR, the one that we report to the FBI, the victim survey indicates that a steep decline has occurred in the number and rate of larcenies during the past decade. Now, most U.S. state criminal codes separate larceny into what they call petty theft, okay, and grand theft. And you can just kind of figure out by the name, petty theft is the lesser of them, and grand theft is the higher section. And in California, the numbers have changed. So now petty theft larceny, which is the smaller or the lesser one, it's theft of a small amount. It's a misdemeanor, okay? And it's not the number of things that you take, it's the amount. In California, petty theft is $950 or less. So anything below that $950 or below is considered petty theft. That's a misdemeanor. You could actually just get a ticket for that. Now, on the other hand, we have grand theft or larceny, same thing. And this is theft of money or property that's more substantial, or the value is more substantial. For California, it's above $950. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's the separation line, the 950, that separates one that's a misdemeanor from the second, the grand theft, which is actually a felony. So I'm hoping that that kind of makes a little bit of sense. So now let's look at some other things, some other ways of theft. So we talked about what larceny is. So now let's look at some different types. Shoplifting is a very common form of theft involving taking or the taking of goods from retail stores. And usually shoplifters try to take goods such as jewelry or clothes or phones or appliances when store personnel are otherwise occupied, and they have time to hide those goods on their bodies or in their, in a purse or a backpack or a bag or something similar. And that's the essence of what shoplifting is. So, I'm not going to show you this video, but if you want to click to it, you can. And again, it doesn't really matter, what the property is that somebody's taking. If you're going into a commercial business and you're taking this property, it is considered shoplifting. All right, so it's the taking of goods from retail stores. And here you can see a woman that's actually taking several bottles of alcohol and gets out of the store, actually. And it's kind of an interesting video, so you can watch that one. So with shoplifting is a phrase called snitches. And this is an amateur shoplifter who does not self-identify as a thief, but who systematically steals for personal use. So whenever we think of snitches, we kind of think of somebody that rats somebody out, that somebody that takes somebody. But again, in a classic study, Mary Owen Cameron found that the majority of shoplifters are amateurs, and they call themselves snitches. And snitches are otherwise respectable people who do not conceive or think of themselves as thieves, but systematically steal merchandise for their own use. If they are not professionals and want to deny their culpability, then the question is, why steal? Some are impulsive sensation seekers who are driven to shoplift by their psychological need to, let's say, live on the edge, and others are motivated by rational choice, and we've talked about that. The desire to get something for nothing. And still another motivation for these people might be, say, psychological distress. Some amateur shoplifters are looking for a release from anxiety or depression. Another type of snitch needs to get quick cash or feed a drug habit. And research has shown that products that serve a role in illicit drug use are actually the ones most often stolen from retail stores. So that's kind of an interesting definition that's a little bit different. A couple of other definitions that fall underneath the shoplifting thing would be what we call boosters. A booster is a professional shoplifter who steals with intention of reselling the stolen merchandise. So, and a booster box is a device that these individuals have that have like a false bottom or a false slot or someplace or something similar that can be opened and closed. And a lot of times it's even lined with metal to prevent the electronic tags from activating. So you look at the picture here, this is a booster purse, or what we call a booster box, and inside of it they've got like aluminum foil and metal in there, and they put whatever they steal that might have one of those alert tags on it, the alarm tags, inside of that to block the alarm tag from going off. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But a lot of these bags have a false bottom that can be opened and shut by the operator, or again, secret little compartments. A lot of times you might even get a professional female shoplifter who will stroll into a store with a baby carriage, accompanied by a friend wearing maternity clothes. And the carriages are used because no one really wants to disturb a sleeping baby that's wrapped in blankets, which of course can be used to hide some of the stolen merchandise. So a lot of interesting devices and things that are used by these individuals to commit retail theft. So lastly, just to kind of show you that there are some things that sort of have been done. So to encourage the arrest of shoplifters, a number of states have passed what they call merchant privilege laws. And these are designed to offer retailers and their employees some protection from lawsuits stemming from improper or false arrests of suspected shoplifters. And these laws require that arrests be made on reasonable grounds or probable cause, that detention be short, and that store employees or security guards conduct themselves reasonably. In addition, security systems now feature source tagging, which is a process by which manufacturers embed the tag in the packaging or in the product itself. And thieves have trouble removing or defeating these tags, and retailers save on the time and labor needed to attach tags in the store. So there has been some legislation that comes out on that, and there's a separate section for shoplifting, like in California. It's 490.5 with subsection F1, and you can go there if you want to see it. But these are some of the things that have come about to help retail establishments from getting sued because they're stopping people that they believe are involved in shoplifting. So now let's move on to another type of theft, if you will, talking about credit card theft. And this is credit card theft encompasses the use of stolen credit cards and credit card numbers. And this has become a major severe problem in the United States, costing consumers and merchants hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Most credit card abuse is the work of amateurs who steal cards or use illegally obtained card numbers and then use them at local stores or online. However, professional credit card rings have also began to pop up and are very, very prevalent across the United States and all over. To curtail individual losses from credit card theft, in 1971, Congress limited a cardholder's liability to $50 per stolen card. And similarly, some states, such as California, have passed laws making it a misdemeanor to obtain property or services by means of cards that have been stolen, forged, canceled, or revoked, or whose use is unauthorized for any reason. But a big issue across the United States. Another type of theft would be auto theft. So motor vehicle theft is another common law larceny offense. And almost every state requires owners to insure their cars. And auto theft is one of the most highly reported of all major crimes. About 75% of all auto thefts are reported to police. Unlike some of the other minor thefts where people won't report. I mean, if someone steals your car, it's very valuable. And of course, you're going to want to get it back and report it to your insurance and all that other stuff. But if someone stole your potted plant, do you really want to call the police? And maybe you do, or maybe you don't. So the FBI now records about 700,000 auto thefts per year, which account for a total loss of about $5 billion. And just as for other crimes, there has been a significant reduction in motor vehicle theft rates over the past decade, and a number of car thefts have declined more than 40%. Now, there are two distinct categories of auto thefts. I want to make sure that we get that out there, or auto thieves. There's the amateur and the professional. A significant number of auto thefts are carried out by amateur thieves who just steal cars for a number of different reasons that involve some form of temporary personal use. And it could be something like joyriding, or short-term transportation, or even long-term transportation, or stealing other cars, as opposed to, let's say, the professional. Because some cars are stolen in order to be sold at places called chop shops for their spare parts, including blue, white, high-intensity discharge headlights, airbags, custom rims, and things like that. So a lot of these cars are taken for different reasons. So here again, we talk about the amateur doing the joyriding, the short-term transportation, and even the long-term transportation, but others are, and also parts and commissions of other crimes, as opposed to maybe the professionals, where they're going to take them for a reason, a much higher reason. So let me kind of finish with that thought. So the question might come to mind, well, what cars are stolen the most? Well, rather than a brand new Porsche or Mercedes or something like that, stolen cars tend to be a little bit older, but popular models that can be quickly sold to these chop shops where their parts are stripped for resale. And the most commonly stolen cars are typically, and it moves around a little bit here and there, but the Honda Accord, the Honda Civic, Ford pickups, a Chevy pickup, a Toyota Camry. These are all different types of things. And there's also something out there called car cloning. And this is using a vehicle identification number, or the VIN number, from an illegally registered car to hide the identity of a stolen vehicle for resale. So you even have individuals that are buying cars at car lots, if you will, and the car has a different VIN on it to make it look like it's okay, but it's been stolen. But the person buys the car, spends the $20,000, as you can see in the picture right here, and now is out $20,000 when the car was actually stolen. So this auto theft thing is a pretty big deal. How much can a thief expect to get for some of those stolen parts? Well, I mean, we can just kind of give you a quick, rundown. The GPS systems in cars, those go anywhere from, let's say, $950 to $1,200. Air conditioning units, anywhere between $500 and $1,000. Airbags, which is a really big deal, about $200. Exhaust systems can go anywhere from, say, $1,500 to $2,800 for some of the luxury systems that you might find in a BMW or a Mercedes. Okay, moving on. Bad checks. So another form of larceny involves intentionally cashing checks on a non-existent or underfunded bank account. Now, in general, for a person to be guilty of passing a bad check, the bank the check is drawn on must refuse payment, and the check casher must fail to make the check good within 10 days after finding out that the check was not honored. Now, Edwin Lamert conducted the best-known study of check forgers about 60 years ago, and he found that the majority of check forgers, and he called them basically naive check forgers, are amateurs who do not believe their actions really hurt anyone. And most of these check forgers come from middle-class backgrounds and have little identification with criminal subculture. They pass bad checks because of a financial crisis that demands some type of immediate resolution, or perhaps they have lost money at the racetrack, or some other pressing bill to pay. So Lamert found that few professionals, who he called systematic forgers, makes a substantial living passing bad checks, although there are some that do. Estimating the number of such forgers committed each year or the amounts involved is difficult, and stores and banks may choose not to press charges because it's not worth it to them to make the effort to collect the money due to them. It's also difficult to separate the true check forger from the negligent shopper, if you will. So those are just some things on check forgers. Receiving stolen property. The crime of receiving stolen goods is a type of larceny or theft that involves the buying or acquiring or possession of property by a person who knows or should have known that the seller acquired it through theft or some other illegal means. So for this to constitute a crime, so for receiving stolen property to be a crime, the receiver must know that the goods were stolen at the time that they received them and must have the intent to aid the thief. Now, depending upon the value of the property being received, receiving stolen property is either a misdemeanor or a felony. And then typically when people get this, when they receive this stolen property, they're going to want to get rid of it, and that's called fencing. And fencing is a crime that involves an ongoing effort to be like the middleman or distributor of illegal goods. Now, to give you a visual, I put a picture of a Rolex in here, and let's just say that you were, at the store and someone in the parking lot opened their trunk and said, hey, it's the holiday season coming up. I have this brand new Rolex right here, and I'm going to give it to you for $300. Now, again, if you know anything about Rolexes, and whether you do or not, they're typically anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 on the low end. Therefore, could you assume that because you're only going to pay $200 to $300 for it, that it's stolen? So, and if you can assume that, if you believe that this was obtained through illegal means and you go ahead and purchase it, then in fact, you could be found guilty of receiving stolen property. So hopefully that example kind of helps out a little bit. And we talked about what the fence is. That's the buyer and seller of all these types of goods. So they're the middleman, the distributor of things like that. Moving on to burglary. Under common law, the crime of burglary was defined as the breaking and entering of a dwelling house or another in the nighttime with the intent to commit a felony within. Burglary is considered much more serious crime than larceny and theft because it typically involves going into someone's home, which could threaten the occupants. And even though the home may be unoccupied at the time of the burglary, the potential for harm to the occupants is so significant that most jurisdictions punish burglary as a felony. Now, burglary has evolved, over the years, and it doesn't have to be at nighttime anymore. The section in California is Penal Code Section 459. You do need specific intent to enter and commit any felony or theft. And I actually put the section down at the bottom here so you can read what it is, because it's not just a house. If you look at the section, every person who enters any house, and this is the evolution part, room, apartment, tenement, shop, warehouse, store, mill, barn, stable, outhouse, tent. So if you're camping and someone goes into your tent, all of these things can be construed as burglary. So again, it doesn't have to be at nighttime. It can be at any time. The house doesn't have to be occupied. It just needs to be considered a residence. And you can see the application, especially in California, on all of these different things that incorporate burglary, if you will. And it even talks about vehicles, but there's some specificity as it relates to burglary. So a little bit more, according to the UCR, which is that report, remember, the Uniform Crime Report, that's where we report the Part 1 statistics of the FBI. About 1.5 million burglaries occur each year. Burglary rates have declined over the past decade. Most of them, though, and you might think this is interesting, occur during the daytime hours. And why do you think that is? I'll give you a second to think about it. Well, typically, a lot of people work during the day or go to school, so homes are empty. and that's when burglars might target it. At nighttime, especially in the middle of the night, people tend to be at home, so typically most will occur during the daytime hours, and the average loss based on some statistical data is usually more than about $2,300. So now we'll move on to one other section, and then we'll get into white collar crime quickly. We'll talk about arson. Arson is the willful, malicious burning of a home, public building, vehicle, or commercial building. And although arson data can be sketchy since only a limited number of jurisdictions report arson, the FBI reports that about 45,000 arsons are now recorded annually, with an average cost of about $14,000 each. And arson attacks are not unique in the United States. There are several motivations for arson. Adult arsonists may be motivated by severe emotional turmoil or disturbed personalities. Research on background characteristics of juvenile fire starters show that their acts are often associated with antisocial behavior and psychopathy. And these findings support the claim that arson should be viewed as a mental health problem, not a criminal act. That's interesting. And should be treated with counseling and other therapeutic type measures rather than with severe punishments. So again, some arsonists are emotionally disturbed. Some are professionals who set fires to gain profit. Some are revenge. If you look at the photo on the top where a woman is throwing fire, liquid fuel on fire over the fence on her neighbor's house. So there's all these different reasons for arson. So now we're going to move into white collar crime, and we're getting close to the end, so we're going to try to stay on track if we can, but we're going to get there. So white collar crime is defined as any business related act that uses deceit or deception or dishonesty to carry out the criminal enterprise or the crime. And included within the scope of white collar dishonesty or white collar crimes are such diverse acts as tax evasion, employee theft, soliciting bribes, accepting kickbacks, and a crime called embezzlement. And nor do criminologists restrict the definition to the wealthy and powerful. Members of all social classes may engage in white collar crime. So, again, even parts of white collar crime include things like business fraud and swindles. We'll talk about Ponzi schemes and telemarketing schemes and things like that. So how much white collar crime takes place each year? Well, it's pretty difficult to calculate. The National White Collar Crime Center conducts periodic national surveys of thousands of people and taps into individual experiences with business crimes to give a picture, if you will, on how widespread white collar crime is and how many people are affected by these business enterprise type crimes. Some of the data that came out of some surveys would be about 24% of households and 17% of people or individuals reported experiencing at least one form of white collar crime within the last year. More than half, or about 55% of households surveyed reported a white collar crime to a credit card company, the business or person involved, law enforcement, or consumer protection agency. Only about 12% of the crimes were reported to law enforcement or some other crime control agency. And last, the general public views white collar crimes as a serious problem, considering them more damaging than traditional crimes. So now let's take a look at a couple of different types of crimes. And just to let you know what a Ponzi scheme is, a Ponzi scheme is a type of swindle that involves the payment of purported returns to existing investors from funds contributed by new investors. So someone sets up, let's say, a mutual fund and promises a 20% interest guarantee. The scheme organizers solicit new investors by promising these high returns with very little or low risk. However, nothing is actually invested. The 20% interest is paid by returning part of the principal each year. At that rate, the scheme can go on for at least 5 years. And again, why are they called Ponzi scheme? Well, the term actually comes from a person by the name of Charles Ponzi, who duped thousands of New England residents into investing in a postage stamp speculation scheme back in the 1920s. So that's where the name came from. And there's telemarketing type frauds and things like that. But let's look at employee fraud and embezzlement. This involves things like employee theft and pilferage, or management fraud, or embezzlement. And this occurs when someone who is with somebody who's entrusted with something or someone else's personal property and fraudulently converts it, or what that really means is that they keep them for themselves. And here's a great case, and you can watch the video if you want, on an individual that was working in the finance department, the accounting department, for many, many years at the Rialto School District. And as lunch money came in, they were supposed to separate the cash and bundle it up and fill out the deposit slips, but she was stealing bits of this money for several years. And this ended up they got caught, she ended up going to court, and her sentence was 5 years. But the video is very interesting, so if you have time, take a look at it. Another type of fraud that's in there would be healthcare fraud. The FBI estimates this costs the nation over $80 billion per year. And there are lots of different types of healthcare schemes. There's tax evasion, which means underpaying or avoiding taxes. There's corporate crime, which talks about illegal restraint of trade, subjects criminal or civil sanctions on any person who shall make any contract or engage in any combination or conspiracy in restraint of interstate commerce. That's the Sherman Antitrust Act, but this is illegal restraint of trade. There's price fixing. Here you can see an article where 9 Japanese auto part makers pled guilty to price fixing, or price gouging, if you will. So you can see all of the different types of things that fit in here. We talk about, again, let me try to give you a better definition of price fixing. So a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act occurs when two or more businesses or business competitors get together, or they conspire to sell the same or similar products at an agreed on price. So one's not higher or lower, they're going to raise the price and they're both going to charge the same thing because people need it. So that's price fixing. So it doesn't become competitive anymore. So hopefully that makes sense. And then there's, false advertising. And I kind of laugh at this one here because it kind of gets to me when you look at the Big Mac on the left on the commercial, and then when you actually get one, it looks like the one on the right. I mean, come on. Anytime you see a commercial like that. So, executives, even in the largest corporations, sometimes face stockholders' expectations of ever-increasing company profits that seem to demand that sales be increased at any cost. And at times they respond to this challenge by making claims about their products that cannot be justified by actual performance. However, there is a fine line between clever, aggressive sales techniques and fraudulent claims, because it is traditional to show a product in its best light, even if that involves resorting to a little bit of fantasy. So maybe that's kind of my issue with the Big Mac, where they fluff it all up and make it look really good on the left, and then when you take it out of the container on the right, that's kind of what you get. Deceptive pricing. This occurs when contractors or businesses provide the government or other corporations with incomplete or misleading information on how much it'll actually cost to fulfill the contract in which they are bidding or something similar. So this is deceptive pricing, and you'll see that. So here you have Ross that's settling a $4.9 million lawsuit over deceptive price tags. So this all falls under this corporate crime kind of issue that we've been going on. All right, and then finally we're going to end up with defining green collar. So there are four interdependent views. There's the legalist view, the environmental justice view, the biocentric view, and basically what we call the harms perspective. So green crime can take many different forms, ranging from deforestation and illegal logging to violations of worker safety. And a few of the most damaging forms are ones that we're going to kind of talk about here for just a minute. So again, we talked about different forms of green crime. We have worker safety or environmental crimes. So some corporations endanger the lives of their own workers by maintaining unsafe conditions in their plants and mines. And it's been estimated that more than 20 million workers have been exposed to hazardous materials while on the job. And some industries have been hit particularly hard by complaints and allegations of this type of stuff. Illegal logging. Illegal logging involves the harvesting or processing and transporting of timber or wood products in violation of existing laws and treaties. It's a universal phenomenon in major timber producing countries, especially in the third world, where enforcement is kind of laxed. Logging violations include things like taking trees in protected areas, like from national parks, or going over legally prescribed quotas, processing logs without acquiring licenses, and even exporting logs without paying those duty fees or exporting fees. Illegal wildlife exports. The smuggling of wildlife across national borders has become a serious matter, and exporters find a lucrative trade in the demand for such illicit wildlife commodities like tiger parts or elephant ivory or rhino horns or certain reptiles. And wildlife contraband may include even live pets or hunting trophies or fashion accessories, etc. So there's a big market for stuff like this. Well, even illegal fishing, unlicensed and illegal fishing practices are another billion-dollar green crime. They can take on many forms and involve highly different parties, ranging from huge factory ships operating on the high seas to catch thousands of tons of fish on each voyage, to smaller locally operating ships that confine themselves to national waters. Illegal fishing basically occurs when these ships sign onto their home nation's rules, but then choose to ignore the scope or the boundaries or to operate within a country's waters without permission on the high seas, etc. So illegal fishing. And then finally, illegal dumping. Some green collar criminals want to skirt or get around local, state, and federal restrictions on doing things like dumping dangerous substances in the environment. And rather than pay the expensive processing fees for this waste, they may secretly dispose of it in illegal dump sites. Illegally dumped waste can be hazardous or non-hazardous materials that are discarded in an effort to avoid the disposal fees or the time and effort required for proper disposal. And it can range from things like used motor oil to waste from construction sites. Now, the criminal environmental pollution, this is a crime involving the intentional or negligent discharge into the biosystem of toxic waste that destroys plant or animal life. So, why do people get involved in these types of risky schemes? Why risk going to prison by polluting the environment? Well, one could be, there's some rational choice things that kind of come into play here, and it's kind of cool to talk about that from past chapters. So why do people do this? Can the same factors that predict other types of criminal offenses also apply to the kinds of crimes that we're talking about now? After all, unlike other criminal offenses, white collar and green collar crimes are not committed by impoverished teenagers living in the inner city, but otherwise respectable people, many of whom were educated and financially well off. By their nature, business and environmental crimes require that offenders attain a position of power and trust before they can be committed. Therefore, can some of these theories that predict and explain these other common law crimes be applied to these type of enterprise crimes? Well, when Kansas City pharmacist Robert Courtney was asked after his arrest why he substituted improper doses of drugs instead of what doctors had prescribed, he told the investigators that he cut the drug's strength out of greed. So Courtney's not alone. One view is that white collar and green collar criminals are greedy, but they are, and they do, rationally choose to take shortcuts in order to acquire their wealth, believing that the potential profits really do outweigh the future punishment. Do you see the rational choice there? So we're talking about greed. So most believe they won't get caught. They're far too clever to get caught. And they take the chance. It's the rational choice. So greed is one. Now, greed, unfortunately, did not end in the 1980s, and the greed that begat the Wall Street crash in 2008 almost sank the world economy. Now, criminologist Neil Shover and Peter Grabowski introduced the concept of another kind of rational choice here, the choice of lure, or what lure is. And to help explain why these people succumb to illegal yet alluring benefits of crime. So tempted individuals possess qualities or experiences that make them more likely than peers who lack these distinctions to weigh illicit exploitation of lure. And lure is something that is alluring, something that is so attractive and covetable that it can turn the heads of those who are tempted or predisposed. When a would-be green-collar criminal sees the wide expanses of uninhabited countryside, they then become tempted to dispose of trash quickly or cheaply. When states create loopholes in the law that provide opportunities that can be manipulated easy for criminal purposes, such as tax incentives, subsidies, low-interest loans, and other forms of access to public funds, these benefits may prove too much of a lure for a business person to resist. And the lure of crime expands in the absence of capable control systems. So that's the lure. Well, then there's the need. So we have greed, lure, and need. So greed is not the only motivation for white collar and green collar crime. Need also plays an important role because some people turn to crime to fulfill an overwhelming financial or psychological need. Executives may tamper with the company's books because they feel the need to keep or improve their jobs or satisfy their egos or support their children. Even people in the upper echelons of the financial world, such as the individual by the name of Bernie Madoff, who did the big Ponzi scam, may carry scars from an earlier needy period in their lives that can only be healed by the accumulation of greater amounts of money. So I hope that kind of makes sense, that there are some rational choices in there. So let's ask ourselves now, and then we're just about done, why do people get involved in these schemes? Why do they risk going to prison? Well, we talked about a few, but let's just look at a few more. So there's the rationalization or the neutralization view. So here's a couple of different views. And these people view it as, you know what, it's not so bad. I just bent the rules a little bit. And then there's the cultural view. Well, there are some businesses that actually promote criminality. It's the culture of the business. There's the self-control view where low self-control, impulse, they don't consider the long-term costs of what's going to happen because they're impulsive and they have that low self-control. What are some ways that we can curtail some of this or control the white-collar crime? Well, we do have environmental laws. We have the Clean Water Act. We have the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. We have the Endangered Species Act, the Oil Pollution Act. People that enforce the laws. We have federal authorities, and we also have the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. When you talk about deterrence versus compliance, the prevailing wisdom is that unlike common law criminals, these white collar and green collar criminals are rarely prosecuted, and when convicted receive relatively light sentences. There have also been charges that efforts to control white collar and green collar crime are biased against specific classes and even races. And authorities seem to be less diligent when the victims are poor or minority group members, or when the crimes take place in areas populated by, let's say, larger minority groups. When Michael Lynch and his associates studied whether petroleum refineries violated environmental laws in Black, Latino, and low-income communities, receive smaller fines than those refineries in white and affluent communities. They found that violations of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act in minority areas received much smaller fines than the same types of violations occurring in white areas. So again, we talk about compliance strategies. These are methods of controlling it. We talk about deterrent strategies. Again, these are methods of controlling white-collar crime that rely on the punishment of individual offenders to deter you as an offender. All right, a lot of information that we covered. That's going to conclude our lecture on Chapter 12, where we discussed economic crimes, blue-collar, white-collar, and green-collar crimes. Do not forget to check out the key terms at the end of the chapter, or they are located in Canvas. And remember to take a look at the critical thinking questions, also located at the end of the chapter, to help you stimulate some of your thought process, and you can apply it to the lecture. So with that being said, again, that concludes our chapter lecture for tonight, and until next time.